You just brought up a couple examples of how the United States is trying to address human rights concerns in China, and especially with China's relations with Darfur. In your book, you also bring up examples of how the United States, how Brazil, how South Africa are all trying to use trade to affect human rights in other countries, but yet they don't look at how trade affects human rights within their own countries. I was wondering if you could talk about this sort of dilemma trade-off, and what would you recommend? How should it be? Is this the right forum? What would you do to move it forward?
Well, I think governments have a hard time thinking about the human rights consequences at home because there's a presumption that it's a positive. But on the other hand, there are certain human rights that governments do worry about the impact on their home population. Certainly more trade can, not always, but can create new jobs and different jobs. So jobs are often created. At the same time, jobs are lost. And the question is, in order to save jobs, what's the impact on labor rights? For example, unionization. And clearly, what we found is every country that we visited, with my colleague Jamie Zimmerman, my co-author, we found, whether it was South Africa, Brazil, the EU, United States, or India, governments were concerned about labor standards and what it meant for especially the skilled workers competing at costs, because of the cost differential. And we see this here in the United States with, it's so funny, many jobs have been quote-unquote outsourced to India, but they're starting to come back, partly because of the decline of the dollar and a wide variety of other factors. Another problem, I think, that is a human rights that increasingly governments pay attention to is intellectual property. Now, the right to property and the right to intellectual property are both basic human rights. But the system designed to protect that right, the system of intellectual property rights, can also undermine access to information, access to affordable medicines. So there can be, on one hand, a positive human rights impact and a negative. And more policymakers are weighing that. But Brazil provides a good case study, and this is very complex. On one hand, Brazil, in its constitution, the Brazilian government is required to purchase affordable medicine for its citizens who are sick with deathly diseases such as AIDS or malaria. And as you know, Brazil has probably the most successful program to deal with AIDS. Malaria is a huge problem in Brazil as well. And the drugs to treat these diseases are extremely expensive. So Brazil has done something called import licensing, where basically they break the patent, or they threaten to do this. And so thus they're undermining the human rights of the patent holder in the interest of the human rights of the people who are sick. And it looks just like a simple thing. And certainly anybody who's sick deserves medicine. The problem is, what we also found is it's not that simple, because Brazil, when they would break these patents, there was also building expertise in their own generic drug industry. And so, on one hand, yes, there's a human rights rationale, but we also saw that Brazil was able to use this problem to build up its own comparative advantage in pharmaceuticals. So it's just not black and white. And Brazil was clearly acting to protect the human rights of its citizens as in its constitution, but at the same time it was also finding ways to do so in ways that built up its own industry, so which we didn't see in South Africa as example. So these issues are just so complex, and there are no easy answers.